The preliminary report of the Air India 171 crash that happened on June 12th was released 2 days ago. So, in this video, I'm going to go through a Bloomberg article on the preliminary findings of this report and give my perspective and take on it as a student pilot. Now, if you're new to my channel, I'm a student pilot that's working on my private pilot's license. I have 45 hours of flight time, and I'm flying out of Rocky Mountain Metro Airport here in Broomfield, Colorado. I would love it if you guys subscribe to my channel to follow my journey. But for now, let's get to the Bloomberg article and see what it says about the Air India 171 crash. So, this article is titled Air India Crash Points to Cockpit Confusion as Fuel Flow Cuts Out. The Air India jetliner that crashed on June 12th was doomed almost immediately upon takeoff, after both engines lost fuel supply and the pilots ran out of time to regain control and avert catastrophe. A preliminary 15-page report filed on July 11th provided the first detailed account of the fateful 32 seconds between takeoff in Ahmedabad and the descent into an urban district just beyond the airport perimeter, where the Boeing Company 787 exploded, killing all but one of the 242 people on board. Investigators laid out the sequence of events with exact timestamps, providing a harrowing picture of the plane's final moments. But the findings leave unanswered one central question. Why and by whom were two fuel switches in the cockpit moved to a cut-off position as the jet nosed into the air, starving the two powerful engines of thrust just as the plane required the most lift? As a student pilot flying a little Cessna 172, we learn about what are the most critical phases of flight, with the most critical phase being takeoff. There's very minimal room for error, and you need maximum power and maximum lift to get that plane off the ground. On every single lesson, we usually run through drills on what I should do if we have an engine failure while I'm on my takeoff roll, and another drill on what we would do if we have an engine failure after takeoff. Why this is considered one of the most critical phases of flight is because you have very little altitude and very little airspeed. So if anything goes wrong, it becomes a very dire situation quickly. The idea that both engines were cut off after takeoff seems like a doomsday scenario. The central question now becomes why and by who were the two fuel switches switched to a cut-off position. In my Cessna 172 Skyhawk, we have a fuel selector valve that allows us to choose where we want to drain fuel from. So we can set that fuel to draining from the left wing, from the right wing, or from both wings. Most of the time when we're flying, we always have our fuel selector set on both so that we're draining fuel equally from both wings. And then I also have a fuel shutoff valve where if I pull that thing out, it immediately cuts off fuel to the engines. In this report, that's exactly what they're talking about. The fuel shutoff valve had cut off fuel flow to the engines, and therefore the engines lost power. Now, on my pre-flight checklist, we can see here on number 21, it says fuel shut off, push on. This allows fuel flow to be directed to the engines. Now, when I move on to my before starting engine checklist, you can see here on number 8 that it says fuel selector on both. And then number 9, it says fuel shut off on. This is to make sure one more time that before we start the engine, we are not cutting off fuel to the engines. That way the engine will be able to start. Now, where this fuel shutoff valve becomes incredibly important is during emergencies. So for example, if I had an engine failure after takeoff, as you see here on my checklist, if you look here at step number 3, it says fuel shut off, off. So pull it out and cut fuel flow to the engines. Let's see if this article provides any clues on why these two switches were in the cutoff position. At the controls for the aircraft's final journey was First Officer Clive Kunder, a pilot with roughly 1,100 flight hours on Boeing's most advanced jet. The report identified him as pilot flying, while Sumit Sabharwal, the more experienced and senior cockpit occupant in command, was pilot monitoring for the flight. It's common for a captain and a co-pilot to switch flying duties, particularly on longer journeys. Under typical pilot protocol, Kunder would have had one hand on the yoke, commanding the wide body into the skies, and another on the throttle, controlling the plane's speed. The crew captain would have handled air traffic communications and responded to Kunder's instructions. All seemed normal as the Boeing 787 lifted off into a clear sky in the western Indian city en route to London's Gatwick Airport. There was no significant bird activity in the flight path, all but ruling out a collision that could have damaged the engines. Then, according to chronology laid out by Indian authorities, the two fuel switches in the plane's center console were flipped about 1 second apart. Even though I'm training to fly solo in my Cessna 172, the concept of dividing tasks amongst each other is a concept that my flight instructor always talks about. At this stage of my flight training, I do most of the flying, but I do get some help with communications and looking at the charts. Things can get overwhelming very quickly, so it really is all about managing the workload. For the pilots of Air India 171, it seems like it was a perfectly beautiful day. There were no birds in the sky, clear skies, and everything was normal. But then all of a sudden, two fuel switches are switched to the cutoff position 1 second apart. Now, in my Cessna, I only have one engine, but if I had two engines, and I had to switch them to a fuel cutoff position, I wouldn't be able to do that at the exact same time. I would need to cut off one and then cut off the other, which to me explains why this was done 1 second apart. And it really points to this being something that was done deliberately by the pilots in the airplane. If there was some sort of mechanical failure or electrical failure that caused these fuel switches to somehow go to the cutoff position, I would imagine that that would be done at the exact same time, because there'd be no reason for one fuel to switch off and then a second later another fuel switch to cut off. So I do find this incredibly suspicious. It's unclear what prompted the maneuver, but it crippled the plane during a critical phase of flight. A fan, known as the ram air turbine, dropped below the plane's belly to provide emergency power, all while the 787 was still within view of the airport cameras. On board, the pilot had a brief exchange, the only cockpit conversation mentioned in the report aside from a final Mayday call just seconds before impact. In the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other why did he cut off. The investigators wrote. The other pilot responded that he did not do so. The report didn't identify which of the two men asked the other about the move. So we have no idea whether it was Kunder speaking to Sumit Sabharwal or whether it was Sumit speaking to Kunder. But maybe if family members or people who know them would listen to this audio, maybe they might be able to identify who is who. It would take about 10 seconds for the first switch to return to its run position, restoring the flow of fuel to the engine, and 14 seconds for the second to be turned back on. Given the aircraft had barely lifted off and was at a critical phase of flight, that's an eternity for pilots only a few hundred feet above the ground and facing a life-threatening emergency. It's just strange, said Bjorn Firm, an aerospace engineer and former fighter pilot who is a technical analyst with Lehman News. I would never ever wait 10 seconds to put them on again. I would put them on in a jiffy. While both engines were relit, only the first one started to regain power before the 787 plunged to the ground. Okay, so this is where it gets really chilling and suspicious. One pilot is asking the other, why did you switch to cut off? Now, as you guys understand from this video so far, switching those switches to the cutoff position would mean that there's no fuel flow to the engines. This is a disastrous scenario. There's no way that this ends well. Now, I've listened to the cockpit audio and the other pilot responds, I did not do so. This is a very interesting exchange between two pilots because there's almost no communication other than that one line being said and the other pilot replying, I did not do so. To me, it sounded like the other pilot got caught in the act doing something really bad and he knows that it's being recorded, and maybe it's to save face and not let the truth come out. He said, I did not do so. But if you listen really carefully, something about this communication exchange sounds like a parent catching a kid doing something really naughty. The other thing that I noticed is it sounds like confusion going on, and that's probably because of one pilot feeling so confused by the other person's actions, and then they're also confused on what to do after this situation happens. Now, my instructor always tells me when I'm flying that if you have an emergency situation, always aviate, navigate, and then communicate. So always fly the aircraft first. This article is stating that it took them over 10 to 14 seconds to get the fuel flow back into the engines. Now, the first thing that you should do in that situation is once they noticed that the fuel flow switch was to cut off, they should have immediately switched that fuel flow back on, and maybe that would have given them a chance. It's very hard for me to say, but that's the very first thing that I would do. And then after that, I would try to communicate Mayday, 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 and announce what's going on. So when I listen to this exchange, there seems to be a fundamental breakdown in the communication that's taking place on this aircraft. The sequence of events was gleaned from different data points, including the cockpit voice and flight data recorders that were recovered from the wreckage. There's no mention in the report of any additional exchanges in the cockpit or of any noises on the flight deck that the sensitive microphones would have picked up. The most important information is the voice dialogue between the pilots, and we only get one line, which is totally inadequate, said Fern. That leaves other key questions unanswered, including how the two pilots interacted as the aircraft sagged back to the ground, and who was ultimately in control in those frantic final seconds. Why one of the men would have conducted the unusual and highly risky maneuver of manipulating both fuel toggles also remains unknown. So, this is the part that I'm sure is super frustrating for investigators and for victims of the families and for all of us that are trying to learn and understand what happened. The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder are basically the black boxes of the aircraft. They're supposed to help tell the story of what's going on in an emergency, where you can get clues from what inputs are being made to the airplane, as well as the communication between the pilots on the airplane. According to Bjorn Firm, and I totally agree with him, that one line between two pilots in an emergency is completely inadequate. Between me and my flight instructor, when we practice emergency situations, the moment we have an urgent emergency, if I'm not capable of handling it, he is super quick to say, I have controls, and he'll take over control of the aircraft. I will say, you have control. He'll say, I have control, and he will take over and handle the emergency situation. When I think about how we handle our emergency situations and how these two pilots were acting, I didn't hear any procedures being called out. I didn't hear anyone taking over and announcing controls of the airplane. So it's very confusing to me why there was not more communication happening at this time. Until now, this article hasn't given us any clues on why the switches were switched to cutoff and who switched them to cutoff. So I think that is still the key question that remains. The switches are secured with a mechanism that requires a specific movement to shift them between on and off mode, and they are idled only when the plane is on the ground or in an emergency during flight, such as an engine fire. So we talked about this earlier. During an emergency like an engine fire, you do want to cut off fuel to the engines. So that's what they're talking about here. Given the trajectory of flight, starving the aircraft of fuel seconds after takeoff made it almost impossible to save the plane because the jet had just left the ground, providing very little recovery room. The Boeing 787 crashed just outside the airport boundary, having grazed some trees before plunging into a hostel packed with students. Some 19 people died on the ground, the report found. The preliminary version hinted at another matter to be explored by the investigators without elaborating. It flagged an airworthiness bulletin by the FAA from 2018 that said that some fuel control switches on Boeing planes, including the smaller 737 and the 787, were installed without their locking mechanism engaged. The Air India jet was not inspected for that mechanism fault, as the matter was not mandatory. No defect relating to the switches had been reported since the throttle control module was replaced in 2023, the report said. Investigators said that they found no evidence so far that would require them to take actions over the Boeing aircraft or the GE Aerospace engines powering it. At this stage of investigation, there are no recommended actions to B787-8 or GEnx-1B engine operators and manufacturers, according to the report from the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau. This part just reinforces that these fuel switches aren't easy to just bump and switch them into cutoff position. These fuel shutoff valves are designed so that it has to be a deliberate action for you to cut off fuel to the engine, because no manufacturer wants you to accidentally shut off fuel to your airplane. It needs to register in your brain that this is not something that you would normally do. So in my case, pulling out that valve is something I would never ever do. There's no other switch or any other action that I would take in the airplane that would resemble doing something like that. And that itself should trigger me that you've just done something wrong. Now, the fact that this happened when they were so low is basically means that there was no room to recover. They had no altitude and they had no airspeed to trade for altitude. The details about this locking mechanism are also interesting, but it seems that they are suggesting that there's no real defect with the airplane, which really shifts the focus back to what was going on inside that cockpit. The National Transportation Safety Board referred any question to the Indian authorities. Air India said it's unable to comment on specific details of the investigation, and it was cooperating with officials. Boeing said it continues to support the investigation and Air India and referred to questions to the AAIB. The people conducting the probe are also looking at the backgrounds of experience of the pilots, a normal step for this kind of investigation. Sabharwal had about 8,500 flight hours, according to the report. Both pilots were based at Mumbai and had arrived in Ahmedabad the previous day with adequate rest period prior to the flight, the report said. We now know with some degree of confidence that both engines rolled back because these fuel switches were activated, said Jeff Guzzetti, a former accident investigation chief for the US FAA. We just don't know why or how these switches were activated, and that's going to be a big part of this investigation. A final report that seeks to determine the cause of this incident will take months to compile. It's clear that there's so much we still don't know. The NTSB and Boeing are deferring to the Indian authorities, which is normal because this happened in India. However, Boeing is a US manufactured aircraft, and so the US will still be involved in this investigation. The fact that they're looking into the pilots' backgrounds and rest periods is also completely normal because they're trying to build a full picture of what was going on with the crew and their state of mind. The article also mentions that Captain Sumit Sabharwal had 8,500 flight hours as a pilot, which is a lot of hours. So clearly, these were very seasoned professional pilots. The question isn't whether they knew how to fly, the question is what was going on in that cockpit and why did this happen? For me as a student pilot, this highlights the immense responsibility that I have every time I step into the airplane as pilot in command. Every control input, every switch, every decision ultimately falls on me as the pilot in command. This is a stark reminder to the unforgiving nature of aviation when things go wrong. It's also an important reminder to understand all the critical systems and every emergency procedure inside and out. My heart goes out to everyone affected by this incident. It's really, truly devastating. I'll definitely keep an eye on this investigation, and as more details come out, I'll stay updated with that on this channel. So please do subscribe if you want to stay updated on that. What do you guys think? Does anything in this article stand out to you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're a pilot or even just an aviation enthusiast, if you saw anything in this article, I would love to know what your initial reactions are. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more aviation content.